Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Charlotte Bühler, the chronicler of life's purposeful unfolding. Together and apart, they mapped the great arc of human becoming, one through the symbolic depths of the psyche, the other through the visible trajectory of lived experience. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the meaning of a life well lived, one seeing an inner mythology written in the language of archetypes and dreams, the other discovering empirical patterns in the choices and goals that shape our years. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Charlotte Bühler as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the quiet hours when consciousness loosens its grip and the mind begins its journey towards sleep, we often find ourselves contemplating the shape of our lives. What has it all meant? Where have we been traveling? Is there a pattern to the years we've lived? A thread connecting the child we were to the person we've become? Two figures in the history of psychology devoted their lives to answering these questions, though they approached them from shores so distant they might have been on separate continents entirely. Yet when we stand back and observe their work from a great height, we see that they were both tracing the same river, following the current of human becoming from different vantage points along its banks. Carl Jung, whom you may know from previous nights we've spent together in these quiet hours, built his psychology in the depths. He was a man who descended into caverns of the unconscious and emerged with maps drawn in symbolic language, speaking of archetypes and collective memory, of the self-seeking wholeness through a process he called individuation. Charlotte Bühler, born a generation after Jung in Berlin at the turn of the 20th century, built her psychology on the surface of lived experience. She watched people move through time, observed the phases of their lives, noted how they set goals and pursued meaning across decades. She was an empiricist where Jung was a mystic, a researcher where he was an explorer of inner space. Yet both, in their own way, were asking, how does a human being become who they are meant to be? How does meaning emerge across the span of a life? And what is the shape of psychological growth when we view it not as a moment but as a journey spanning birth to death? Let us begin with Jung, as we always must in these comparisons, for he is our constant companion, our reference point in the night. But let us meet him not in his early years, not in the days of his collaboration and rupture with Freud, but in his middle period, the 1920s and 30s, when his thinking about the second half of life began to crystallize. This was when Jung, himself in his 40s and 50s, started to articulate what would become one of his most enduring insights, that human development doesn't end with the achievement of ego, strength, and social adaptation, but that there is a second great task waiting for those who reach the afternoon of life. Picture Jung in his tower at Bollingen, that stone sanctuary he built with his own hands on the shores of Lake Zurich. He is a man in his middle years now, No longer the young psychiatrist struggling with the overwhelming forces of the unconscious that nearly consumed him during his confrontation with the inner world. He has emerged from his own dark night and has begun to understand that what happened to him was not breakdown, but breakthrough, not pathology, but a necessary passage. The symbols that flooded his consciousness, the figures that spoke to him in visions and dreams, were not signs of madness, but invitations to a deeper kind of wholeness. Jung noticed something in his practice that troubled the neat developmental models of his time. The patients who came to him in midlife were not suffering from the neuroses of sexual repression that Freud's theories explain so well. They were suffering from something else entirely, something that might be called a crisis of meaning. They had achieved what society asked of them. They had built careers, raised families, secured their place in the world. Yet they came to him feeling hollow, sensing that life was slipping away from them, that they had lost connection to something essential. They described feeling as if they were living someone else's life, following a script written by parents or culture or the demands of survival, but not by their own deeper nature. What these patients needed, Jung came to believe, was not adjustment to external reality, but connection to internal reality. They needed to discover or rediscover the self, that center of the personality that transcends the ego, that holds the blueprint for who they might become if they followed their own nature rather than the demands of collective expectation. This process, which Jung called individuation, became the cornerstone of his psychology of the second half of life. Individuation, for Jung, was not something that could be planned or willed into being. It emerged through attending to the messages of the unconscious, through dreams and symptoms and synchronicities, through active imagination and symbolic work. It required withdrawing projection from the external world and discovering that the gods and demons we see outside are actually aspects of our own psyche. It required integrating the shadow, those parts of ourselves we've disowned or denied. It required encountering the anima or animus, the contrasexual other within. And ultimately, it required submitting to something larger than the ego, allowing the self to guide the process according to its own mysterious logic. Jung's was a psychology of depth and symbol, of myth and archetype. When he looked at a human life, he saw it as a hero's journey, a quest for wholeness that echoed the great stories humanity has always told. The first half of life was about ego development, about building a strong container that could navigate the external world. The second half was about transcendence of the ego, about discovering that we are more than we thought we were, connected to patterns and forces that stretch back to the beginning of human consciousness itself. This was Jung's vision when Charlotte Bühler began her work in Vienna in the 1920s. She was a young psychologist then, fresh from her studies in Berlin and Munich, where she had worked with some of the most innovative thinkers of the age. She had married Carl Bühler, himself a distinguished psychologist, and together they created what would become one of the most important research centers in European psychology at the University of Vienna. The Bühler's Institute was a place of rigorous empirical work, of careful observation and systematic study. It was a world away from Jung's tower and his explorations of the collective unconscious. Charlotte Bühler's background was in child development. She had spent years observing infants and children, documenting the stages through which they progressed, mapping the emergence of social behavior and cognitive capacity. She was part of a generation of psychologists who believed that the way to understand the human mind was through careful, systematic observation, through data collection and analysis, through building theories that could be tested and verified. Where Jung had been drawn to the exceptional, the symbolic, the depths that revealed themselves in crisis and vision, Bühler was drawn to the ordinary, the observable, the patterns that emerged when you studied enough cases to see the regularities beneath individual variation. But Charlotte Bühler had a vision that was unusual for her time and place. Most developmental psychologists focused exclusively on childhood and adolescence, as if human development simply stopped once a person reached maturity. Bühler looked at this assumption and found it wanting. Why should growth and change be limited to the early years? What about the vast span of adult life, the decades between 20 and 70, 80, 90? Wasn't there development happening there too? Weren't there patterns to be discovered in how people navigated the middle years, how they approached old age, how they made meaning of their entire lifespan? In the early 1930s, Bühler began a series of studies that would occupy her for the rest of her career. She collected biographies, hundreds of them, from people of all backgrounds and walks of life. She read diaries and autobiographies. She interviewed subjects about their life stories, asking them to reflect on the major turning points, the goals they had pursued, the meanings they had found or failed to find. And from all this rich, detailed material, she began to discern patterns, stages, a shape to human lives when viewed from beginning to end. What Bühler discovered was that lives had structure. They moved through predictable phases, each with its own tasks and challenges. Early adulthood was characterized by expansion, by the pursuit of goals, by building and establishing oneself in work and family. The middle years often brought a shift, sometimes a crisis, when people began to question whether the goals they had been pursuing were truly their own. Later, adulthood involved integration, a looking back and making sense of the whole, a final reckoning with what one's life had meant. She found that people who reported high life satisfaction tended to be those who had pursued goals that felt personally meaningful, who had experienced their lives as self-directed rather than imposed from without, who could look back and see coherence and purpose in the arc of their years. This might sound, at first hearing, remarkably similar to Jung's vision. Both psychologists were insisting that development continues throughout life. Both saw midlife as a crucial turning point. Both emphasized the importance of meaning and purpose. Both believed that the examined life, the life lived with conscious intention and self-awareness, was somehow more complete than a life lived purely in reaction to external demands. Yet, if we listen more carefully, we begin to hear profound differences in what these two thinkers meant by development, by meaning, by the very nature of what it is to become a self. These differences are not superficial. They arise from fundamentally different assumptions about human nature, about consciousness, about the visible and invisible forces that shape us. To understand their dialogue, we must attend to these differences with patience and care. Charlotte Bühler arrived in the United States in 1940, a refugee from the Nazi annexation of Austria. She was 42 years old, at the height of her intellectual powers, forced to rebuild her career in a new country and a new language. She settled eventually in California, where she continued her research on adult development and became increasingly interested in questions of meaning and self-determination. In the 1950s and 60s, she became associated with the emerging humanistic psychology movement, working alongside figures like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Jung, 20 years her senior, had taken a different path. By the 1940s, he was an old man. still working but increasingly focused on the large synthetic works that would complete his vision. Aeon, Mysterium Conjunctionis, his studies of alchemy and Gnosticism and the Christian myth. He had become a controversial figure, revered by some as a sage and dismissed by others as a mystic who had abandoned scientific psychology for metaphysics and speculation. Did they know each other's work? This is difficult to say with certainty. Jung was famous in intellectual circles by the time Bühler was doing her major research in the 1930s. His ideas about psychological types, about the collective unconscious, about the second half of life, were widely discussed even among psychologists who didn't accept his theoretical framework. Bühler, however, left few direct references to Jung in her published work. She was working in a different tradition, one more aligned with academic psychology and empirical research than with depth psychology and clinical practice. Yet, there are intriguing hints of mutual awareness. Both were part of the European psychological establishment before World War II. Both attended international conferences. Both were concerned with similar questions about human development and meaning. In the small world of mid-century psychology, it seems unlikely that Bühler was entirely unfamiliar with Jung's ideas. Just as Jung, with his wide-ranging intellectual curiosity, may well have encountered Bühler's developmental research, what matters for our purposes tonight is not whether they sat down together for conversation, but that their work creates a conversation nonetheless. They are two voices addressing the same essential questions from perspectives so different they illuminate aspects of human experience that the other leaves in shadow. To bring them into dialogue is to enrich our understanding of both, to see the terrain of human development from multiple angles. To appreciate that truth about the psyche may be too large and complex for any single perspective to capture completely. Consider the cultural moment that shaped them both. Jung came of age in the late 19th century, in a Europe still steeped in romanticism, in the sense that there were depths to reality that rationalism and science could not fathom. He was influenced by German idealism, by Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, by the symbolist poets and the esoteric traditions that had survived in the margins of Western culture. His was a world where it still made sense to speak of the soul, where the invisible realms of dream and myth and spiritual experience were taken seriously as sources of knowledge. Bühler came of age after the catastrophe of World War I, in a Europe desperately trying to rebuild, itself on more rational foundations. Her training was in the new scientific psychology, in the careful empirical methods that Wilhelm Wundt and others had established. She believed in progress, in the power of observation and measurement to reveal truth, in psychology as a natural science that could improve human life through systematic knowledge. She was suspicious of metaphysics, wary of grand theories that couldn't be tested, committed to building understanding one careful study at a time. These were not just personal preferences, but reflections of profound shifts in European intellectual culture. Jung represented a last flowering of the Romantic tradition, an attempt to preserve the depth dimension of human experience in an age increasingly dominated by materialism and mechanism. Bühler represented the 20th century's commitment to scientific rigor, to secular humanism, to finding meaning and value within human experience itself rather than in transcendent or transpersonal realms. The different circumstances of their lives also shaped their work in important ways. Jung spent most of his career in private practice, working intensively with individual patients in long-term analysis. His knowledge of the psyche came from the consulting room, from the dreams and fantasies and life stories that people brought to him in distress. He had the luxury of time, of going deep with each patient, of following their process wherever it led, without the constraints of academic research protocols or the need to produce generalizable results. Bühler, especially after emigrating to America, worked in a more institutional context. She needed to secure research funding, to publish in peer-reviewed journals, to train graduate students. Her knowledge came from studying populations, from identifying patterns across many cases, from formulating theories that could be tested and replicated. She had to justify her methods to skeptical colleagues, to demonstrate that her findings were based on evidence rather than intuition or speculation. Jung could afford to be a maverick, following his own vision even when it diverged from mainstream psychiatry. Bühler had to maintain her scientific credibility, to work within the accepted paradigms of academic psychology, even as she pushed those paradigms to include questions they had previously neglected. The constraints she faced were real, but they also gave her work a rigor and generalizability that Jung's lacked. Where Jung spoke in the language of myth and symbol that resonated deeply with some but seemed obscure or even meaningless to others, Bühler spoke in the language of empirical research, of data and variables and measurable outcomes, a language that could cross cultural boundaries and be understood by psychologists around the world. As Charlotte Bühler settled into her new life in America, she found herself in a culture quite different from the European world she had known the United States in. The 1940s and 50s was optimistic, forward-looking, pragmatic. American psychology was dominated by behaviorism, by the belief that psychology should study only observable behavior, that consciousness itself was a black box that needn't be examined. Talk of inner experience, of meaning and purpose, was viewed with suspicion as unscientific speculation. Yet there were stirrings of dissatisfaction with this narrow vision. Some psychologists felt that something essential about human nature was being left out, that people were more than stimulus-response machines, that consciousness and subjectivity and the search for meaning were real phenomena worthy of serious study. In the 1950s, this dissatisfaction coalesced into what came to be called humanistic psychology, sometimes known as the third force in psychology, an alternative to both behaviorism and psychoanalysis. Bühler became one of the founding figures of this movement. Along with Abraham Maslow, she helped establish the American Association for Humanistic Psychology in 1961. She brought to this movement her European background, her decades of research on development across the lifespan, her insistence that human beings are goal-directed organisms who actively shape their own lives in pursuit of meaning. She argued that psychology needed to study healthy development, not just pathology, that it needed to understand people's aspirations and values, not just their drives and conditioning, that it needed to respect human dignity and freedom rather than reducing people to mechanical or biological processes. In all of this, there was an interesting resonance with Jungian psychology, though Bühler approached these questions from a very different angle. Jung, too, had rebelled against reductionism, had insisted on the reality and importance of the inner life, had focused much of his attention on healthy development rather than just treating illness. The humanistic psychologists, including Bühler, shared Jung's vision of human beings as more than the sum of their traumas and conflicts, as possessing an innate drive toward growth and self-realization. Yet the humanists, especially Bühler, wanted to understand these processes without recourse to what they saw as Jung's mysticism. They wanted to remain scientific, empirical, grounded in observable phenomena. They were willing to study consciousness and subjective experience, but through methods like structured interviews and biographical analysis, not through interpretation of symbols and exploration of archetypes. They believed that meaning was something people created through their choices and commitments, not something they discovered by accessing a collective unconscious filled with universal patterns. This difference goes to the heart of their contrasting visions. For Jung, the really important psychological development happened in the depths, in the unconscious. Consciousness was in some sense superficial, a late and fragile achievement of evolution, a thin crust floating on an ocean of unconscious contents. To truly grow, to individuate, required going down into those depths, encountering the autonomous figures that dwelled there, learning their language of symbol and image. The ego had to learn to serve the self, to align itself with purposes larger than its own conscious intentions. For Bühler, the important development happened in consciousness, in the lived experience of moving through time, setting goals, making choices, building a life. The unconscious, to the extent she acknowledged it at all, was not particularly interesting. What mattered was how people consciously experienced their lives, what goals they set for themselves, whether they felt their lives had meaning and direction. Growth was not about descending into depths, but about moving forward through time with intention and purpose. The self was not a transcendent center beyond consciousness, but the integrated totality of a person's conscious experience across their lifespan. Imagine Jung and Bühler sitting together in a quiet room, perhaps in California in the 1950s. Jung has come to give lectures, as he sometimes did in his later years. Bühler, now established at the University of Southern California, has come to hear him. Afterward, they find themselves in conversation. Jung, in his 70s now, speaks in his accented English with the authority of a man who has spent decades exploring the frontiers of consciousness. Bühler, in her late 50s, listens with the careful attention of a scientist trying to understand a worldview quite different from her own. Jung might begin by asking about her research. He has always been interested in how other psychologists work, what they've discovered. Bühler describes her biographical studies, her finding that lives move through predictable phases, that meaning comes from pursuing personally relevant goals across the lifespan. She explains her interest in self-determination, in how people become authors of their own lives rather than merely responding to circumstances. Jung nods, recognizing something familiar. Yes, he says. This resonates with his own understanding of the second half of life, with his observation that midlife brings a crucial shift in orientation. He too has seen how important it is for people to discover their own path rather than living according to collective expectations. The process of individuation, he explains, is precisely about becoming who you truly are rather than who you've been taught to be. But then, gently, he begins to probe. This conscious planning of life, the setting of goals and pursuit of meaning through self-determination, isn't there something missing? What about the unconscious, the dreams that guide us in ways consciousness cannot foresee? What about the symbols that emerge spontaneously, pointing toward a wholeness we didn't know we were seeking? What about synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences that suggest we're part of a larger pattern we can't entirely control? Jung might tell her about a patient, perhaps a woman in her 40s, who came to him with all the outward signs of success. She had set goals and achieved them, built a career, raised a family, done everything she thought would bring satisfaction. Yet she was profoundly depressed, felt her life was meaningless. In analysis, a dream emerged. She was in a stone temple, very ancient, and a voice told her she had been living in the outer courts, but now must enter the inner sanctuary. This dream became the key to her transformation. She realized she had been living entirely in the persona, the social mask, and had lost connection to her deeper self. The work of the second half of life, for her, wasn't about setting new conscious goals, but about learning to listen to the unconscious, to honor the symbolic life that had been starved by her exclusive focus on external achievement. How, Jung might ask, would your biographical method capture this? The important development happened beneath the surface of her observable life. On paper, her biography before and after analysis might look similar, same marriage, same career, same social roles. But internally, everything had shifted. She had discovered another dimension of existence entirely. Isn't this what really matters? Bühler might respond with her own patient story, though she would call them subjects rather than patients, research participants rather than analysands. She might describe a man she interviewed, someone in his 60s looking back on his life. He spoke of the goals he had set in youth to become a doctor, to serve his community, to raise children who would contribute to society. Through decades of conscious effort and decision-making, he had done these things, and now, in the later years, he felt a deep satisfaction, a sense that his life had been meaningful precisely because he had lived it according to values he consciously held, had worked toward ends he believed were worthwhile. This satisfaction, Bühler might say, came not from accessing some unconscious symbolic realm, but from the coherent structure of his conscious life story. He could narrate his life as having direction and purpose. He had experienced himself as an agent, making choices that mattered. This is what we find again and again in our research, she would explain. People who report life satisfaction are those who have pursued self-determined goals, who feel their lives have been expressions of their own values and commitments. We can measure this, study it across populations, identify the factors that contribute to it. This is something psychology can investigate empirically. But, she might press him, your symbolic interpretation, how do we know it's true? How do we distinguish genuine insight from projection, from reading into dreams, whatever meanings we expect to find? When? You say this woman discovered her deeper self. How do we verify that? Couldn't she just have been influenced by your theories? Came to believe she had an anima and a self because you suggested these things to her? Where is the evidence that can be examined independently of your interpretive framework? Jung might smile at this, having heard such objections many times before. Evidence, he would say, is not only what can be measured and counted. The psyche gives its own evidence in the transformations it produces, in the sense of rightness that comes when a true symbol is grasped, in the concrete changes in people's lives when they align with their individuation process. As for projection, yes, this is always a danger, but the unconscious has its own reality, produces its own images that surprise us precisely because they don't come from conscious intention. When dreams or fantasies produce symbols that the dreamer has never heard of, that match ancient mythological motifs from cultures they've never studied, isn't this evidence of something beyond personal conditioning? And so their conversation might continue, each appreciating the other's concerns while remaining rooted in fundamentally different ways of knowing. They are speaking from different epistemological traditions, different assumptions about what counts as knowledge and how it can be gained. Jung is a phenomenologist in the tradition of German philosophy, trusting the evidence of inner experience, using a hermeneutic method that seeks to understand meaning rather than establish causal laws. Bühler is an empiricist in the Anglo-American scientific tradition, trusting only what can be observed and measured, seeking generalizable laws that can be tested against new data. Neither approach is simply right or wrong. Each reveals something the other misses. Each has its strengths and limitations. To hold them both in mind is to gain a stereoscopic vision of human development, to see it in greater depth and complexity than either vision alone permits. Let us now move more deeply into the specific concepts that define their work, examining how each understood the great questions of human growth and meaning. We begin with their different understandings of life stages, the phases through which a human being passes from birth to death. For Charlotte Bühler, life stages were observable periods characterized by particular tasks and goals. Based on her biographical studies, she identified several major phases: childhood and adolescence, roughly birth to 15 years, were periods of growth and learning, of acquiring the capacities needed for adult life. Youth and early adulthood, roughly 15 to 25, were characterized by self-determination, by exploring possibilities and beginning to define oneself through choices and commitments. The expansion phase, roughly 25 to 45, was the period of greatest productivity, of building career and family, of pursuing the goals one had set. The middle years, 45 to 65, often brought reappraisal, a questioning of whether one's goals had been the right ones, sometimes a reorientation toward new sources of meaning. Late adulthood, 65 onward, was a time of integration and review, of looking back and making peace with the life one had lived. These stages were based on observable patterns in people's life stories. Bühler found that when you asked people to describe their lives, certain themes emerged at certain ages. Young adults talked about discovering themselves, about figuring out what they wanted to do with their lives. Middle-aged people talked about either fulfillment or disappointment in their achievements, about sometimes feeling stuck or wondering if they'd made the wrong choices. Elderly people talked about accepting their lives, about making sense of the whole trajectory, about preparing for death. Importantly, Bühler saw these stages as shaped by both biological maturation and social context. The expansion of early adulthood happened when people were at their physical peak and when society expected them to establish themselves. The reappraisal of midlife often coincided with declining physical vitality and with the completion of major life projects, like raising children. The integration of late adulthood came when people had the leisure to reflect and when the approach of death made the question of life's meaning urgent. For Bühler, development across these stages was not automatic. It required conscious effort, active engagement with life's tasks. The people who aged most successfully were those who maintained a sense of purpose, who continued to set and pursue meaningful goals, who adapted their ambitions to changing circumstances but didn't simply become passive. She emphasized agency, the capacity to shape one's own life story rather than simply being shaped by circumstances. Jung's understanding of life stages was quite different, though it covered similar territory. He, too, emphasized a major division between the first and second halves of life, which he located around the age of 35 or 40. But his stages were not defined by observable life tasks, but by the psyche's internal development, by shifts in the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. The first half of life, for Jung, was devoted to ego development. The child must separate from the original unconsciousness, must develop a stable sense of I, distinct from mother and family and collective. The young adult must strengthen this ego, learn to navigate the external world, establish themselves in work and relationship. This requires developing the persona, the social mask, learning to adapt to collective expectations. It requires identifying with certain functions, thinking or feeling, sensation or intuition, and relegating their opposites to the shadow. It requires, for men, developing a masculine identity by repressing the inner, feminine, and for women, developing a feminine identity by repressing the inner masculine. All of this is necessary, Jung insisted. We need a strong ego, a stable personality, competence in dealing with external reality. The first half of life is about extension, about expanding into the world, about achievement and establishment. The goals of this period are essentially adaptive: to find your place in society, to succeed according to its measures, to fulfill biological and social imperatives. But then, if all goes well, comes the turn. Somewhere in midlife, the values and goals that sustained the first half of life lose their power. Achievement no longer satisfies. Social roles feel confining. The persona becomes a prison. What Jung called the noon of life brings a crisis, sometimes gradual, sometimes sudden. The unconscious begins to make itself heard more insistently through dreams, symptoms, accidents, depressions, anxieties that have no clear external cause. This crisis is not a breakdown, but an invitation. The psyche is signaling that it's time for a new phase, for the second great task of life. This task is not adaptation, but individuation, not expansion outward, but deepening inward. Where the first half of life was about ego development, the second half is about relativizing the ego, recognizing that it's not the center of the personality, but a complex among complexes, a voice in dialogue with larger forces. Individuation requires withdrawing projection from the external world and discovering the inner world of archetypes. It requires integrating the shadow, accepting and reclaiming the parts of ourselves we've disowned. It requires encountering the anima, or animus, the contrasexual other within, learning to relate to it rather than projecting it onto external partners. It requires confronting the archetype of the self, that center and circumference of the personality that holds the pattern of wholeness, that guides the individuation process, according to its own unfathomable wisdom. This process cannot be programmed or controlled. It has its own timetable, its own logic. The ego must learn to listen, to attend to dreams and fantasies, to follow the thread of symbols wherever they lead. Often this involves regression, going backward into forgotten parts of childhood, down into the collective unconscious where the great primordial images dwell. It involves death and rebirth, the dissolution of the rigid structures of the first half of life and their reconstitution in a more flexible form. It involves sacrifice, letting go of ego ambitions in service to something larger. For Jung, this process continues until death and probably beyond. There is no final achievement, no completion, only an endless deepening relationship with the mystery of the psyche. The goal is not happiness or satisfaction in any conventional sense, but wholeness, which includes both light and dark, both order and chaos, both consciousness and unconscious. The individuated person is not necessarily better adapted to collective life, might in fact be less adapted, but has achieved an inner relationship to the self that makes external validation less necessary. Now we can begin to see the profound differences between Bühler's and Jung's developmental visions. On the surface, they're both talking about stages of life, both emphasizing the importance of midlife transformation. But they're actually describing different phenomena, or rather, different dimensions of the same phenomena. Bühler is mapping the outer biography, the visible life story. Her stages are defined by observable events and conscious experiences. Her developmental tasks are achievable through conscious effort and decision-making. Her measure of successful development is subjective satisfaction with one's life story, the sense that one has lived according to personally meaningful goals. Jung is mapping the inner mythology, the invisible story of the soul. His stages are defined by shifts in the structure of consciousness itself, by changes in the relationship between ego and unconscious. His developmental task individuation cannot be directly willed, but must be allowed to unfold according to the self's guidance. His measure of successful development is wholeness, integration of conscious and unconscious, alignment with one's deeper nature, whether or not this brings happiness or social success. Put another way, Bühler's psychology addresses the question, how do I live a meaningful life? Her answer, by setting goals that reflect your values, by actively shaping your life story, by maintaining purpose and engagement across the lifespan. Jung's psychology addresses the question, how do I become who I am? His answer, by attending to the unconscious, by following the symbolic life, by allowing the self to guide your transformation even when you don't understand where it's leading. These are not contradictory, but complementary. Questions. A complete psychology of human development might need both perspectives. Bühler helps us understand the conscious ego's journey through time, how we build meaningful lives through choice and commitment. Jung helps us understand the soul's journey through transformation, how we're being shaped by forces larger than ego consciousness. Consider a concrete example. A woman in her 40s has built a successful career as a lawyer. She set this goal in young adulthood, worked hard to achieve it, found satisfaction in her competence and accomplishments. From a Bühlerian perspective, this represents healthy development. She set a self-determined goal and pursued it with success. Her life story has coherence and meaning. But now, she's having disturbing dreams. She dreams of being trapped in a glass building, beating on the walls but unable to break through. She dreams of wild animals, of forests, of a stone circle under the stars. She finds herself crying at unexpected moments, feeling a nameless longing, questioning everything she's built. Her rational mind sees no reason for this distress. Her life is good. She has everything she worked for. From a Jungian perspective, these dreams and feelings are not problems, but messages. The unconscious is signaling that the persona of the successful lawyer has become too narrow, that parts of her nature are being starved. The wild animals represent instinctual energies that have been overly controlled. The stone circle suggests a need for connection to something ancient, transpersonal. The glass building is the prison of a one-sided conscious attitude. The psyche is initiating a transformation, calling her to a deeper life. What this woman needs is not more conscious goal-setting, but attention to the symbolic life. She might need to explore her dreams through active imagination, to discover what these images want from her. She might need to withdraw energy from external achievement and turn it inward. She might need to accept a period of uncertainty and confusion as the psyche reorganizes itself at a deeper level. She might emerge from this process with different priorities, different values, a different relationship to her career, not because she consciously decided to change, but because she followed the thread of symbols to a place she couldn't have anticipated. This is where Jung's approach offers something Bühler's cannot: the symbolic dimension of experience, the autonomous activity of the unconscious, the transformation that happens when we attend to images and dreams. None of this fits easily into an empirical, biographical framework. Yet it's real, produces real effects in people's lives, answers to psychological needs that conscious planning and goal-setting alone cannot meet. But now, consider the same woman from another angle. Perhaps her distress comes not from a psyche seeking transformation, but from having lived according to others' expectations rather than her own values. Perhaps she became a lawyer because her parents wanted it, because society values such careers, because she was good at the work that led there, but it was never truly her goal, never reflected her deepest values and interests. The dreams of forests and stone circles might represent not archetypes, but simply aspects of herself that she ignored in pursuit of a goal that wasn't genuinely hers. From a Bühlerian perspective, what this woman needs is conscious reappraisal of her life goals. She needs to ask herself, what do I truly value? What would make my life feel meaningful to me, not to others? What goals would I set now if I gave myself permission to choose freely? And then she needs to take action to make changes in her external life that align it with her authentic values. Perhaps she reduces her work hours and pursues interests that fulfill her more deeply. Perhaps she changes careers entirely. The key is conscious agency, self-determination, creating a life story that feels truly her own. This is where Bühler's approach offers something Jung sometimes neglects: the importance of conscious choice, of agency, of actively shaping one's life rather than waiting for the unconscious to reveal its purposes. These are real psychological needs too. Some people do need to be told, you have the power to change your life. You don't have to wait for transformation to happen to you. You can decide what matters to you and then work toward it. This message can be liberating in a way that Jung's emphasis on following the unconscious, on ego sacrifice, on waiting for the self's guidance, sometimes is not. Of course, the wise therapist would recognize that both approaches might be needed, perhaps at different times or in different proportions depending on the individual. Some people are too identified with conscious control and need to learn to listen to the unconscious. Others are too passive, too willing to let life happen to them, and need to claim their agency. The complete therapeutic response would honor both the conscious and unconscious dimensions of development, both the importance of self-determination and the reality of autonomous psychic processes. But Jung and Bühler, writing from their different perspectives, tended to emphasize one side over the other. This was perhaps necessary. Each needed to articulate their vision clearly and forcefully, to establish their perspective against the dominant assumptions of their time. Jung was reacting against a psychology that recognized only consciousness and denied the reality of the unconscious. Bühler was reacting against a psychology that reduced people to passive responders and denied their capacity for self-direction. Each emphasized what they saw being neglected. Let us turn now to their different understandings of meaning, that central concern they shared but interpreted so differently. For both Jung and Bühler, human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. We're not satisfied with mere survival or pleasure. We need to feel that our lives matter, that they have purpose and significance. But what is meaning, and where does it come from? For Charlotte Bühler, Meaning was essentially something people create through their choices and commitments across the lifespan. In her research, she found that people experienced their lives as meaningful when they could tell a coherent story about them, when they felt they had pursued goals that reflected their values, when they saw their efforts as having made a difference. Meaning wasn't something mystical or transcendent, but a quality of lived experience that arose from self-determined engagement with life. She identified several dimensions of meaning. There was creative accomplishment, the sense of having produced something, having built or made or achieved something of value. There was experiential fulfillment, the enjoyment of beauty, love, connection, the richness of lived experience itself. There was attitudinal, meaning the sense that one had faced life's challenges with courage and dignity, that one's responses to circumstances had been worthy even when circumstances themselves were difficult. And there was legacy, the feeling that one had contributed to something beyond oneself, that one's life would have effects that continued after death. These dimensions could be pursued consciously. People could set goals related to achievement, or to deepening their relationships, or to developing certain qualities of character, or to contributing to causes larger than themselves. The key was that the goals had to be self-determined, had to reflect the individual's own values rather than mere conformity to external expectations. When people lived according to goals they had consciously chosen, when they could look back and see a coherent trajectory to their lives, when they felt they had been agents rather than victims, this is when they reported high life satisfaction, when they experienced their lives as meaningful. Bühler's vision was secular and humanistic. Meaning didn't require belief in God or connection to transcendent realms. It arose from human life itself, from engagement with the tasks and opportunities and challenges that every life presents. She saw this as liberating. People didn't have to wait for meaning to be given to them by religion or revealed to them by symbols. They could create meaning through how they chose to live. Jung's understanding of meaning was almost entirely different. For him, meaning was not primarily something we create, but something we discover. It exists prior to consciousness, woven into the fabric of the psyche itself, expressed in the universal patterns of the archetypes. To find meaning is not to set goals, but to align oneself with one's deeper nature, to follow the path the self has laid out even when we don't understand its purpose. Jung often spoke of vocation, calling, fate. He believed that each person is born with a unique pattern, a potential wholeness that wants to be realized. This pattern isn't something we choose. It's given, part of our nature, like the color of our eyes or our basic temperament. The task of individuation is to discover this pattern and live it out, to become who we already are in potentia. This is what gives life meaning, not achieving goals we consciously set, but fulfilling our particular destiny. This meaning is discovered through symbols, dreams, fantasies, myths. These are the language in which the unconscious communicates the pattern of our wholeness. When a dream image grips us, when a mythological motif resonates deeply, when a synchronistic event seems to confirm the rightness of our path, these are signs that we're in alignment with the self's purpose. Meaning has a numinous quality, carries a charge of energy and significance that tells us we've touched something real and important. For Jung, meaning is often paradoxical, even irrational by ego standards. The self's purposes don't necessarily align with conscious wishes or social values. Individuation might lead someone away from conventional success toward a path that looks like failure or madness from outside. Jung himself experienced this when he left behind his promising career as a psychiatrist to explore his own unconscious, a journey that many of his colleagues saw as evidence of breakdown. Yet he knew with absolute certainty that he was following his vocation, doing what he must do. This knowing didn't come from conscious reasoning, but from the symbolic life, from the inner figures that spoke to him, from the sense of numinosity that attended his explorations. Meaning, for Jung, connects us to something transpersonal. When we follow the individuation process, we're not just becoming ourselves as separate individuals. We're also discovering our connection to the collective psyche, to the great patterns that have shaped human consciousness since its beginning, the archetypes we encounter in dreams are not just personal contents, but universal structures. The myths that speak to us have been speaking to humans for millennia. To individuate is to find our particular place in a vast archetypal drama, to play our unique part in a story that transcends any single life. This gives a different quality to meaning than what Bühler described. Jungian meaning has weight, depth, a sense of participation in something sacred. It's less about what we accomplish in the world than about the inner transformation we undergo. A life might look unremarkable from outside, no great achievements, no lasting legacy, yet be profoundly meaningful if the person has lived in close relationship to the self, has followed their symbolic life, has undergone the transformations the psyche demanded of them. The contrast between these visions of meaning is stark. Bühler's is secular, conscious, emphasizing agency and choice. Jung's is sacred, largely unconscious, emphasizing discovery and surrender. Bühler's meaning is validated by subjective satisfaction and life satisfaction. Jung's meaning is validated by the sense of numinosity, by symbolic confirmation, by the feeling of being in alignment with something larger than ego. Which vision is truer? Perhaps the question itself is misleading. They're addressing different dimensions of meaning, both of which are real. Bühler helps us understand meaning as conscious life planning, as the coherence we create through our choices across time. Jung helps us understand meaning as symbolic unfolding, as the sacred dimension that emerges when we attend to the unconscious. A complete understanding of meaning might require both. We do need to make choices, to set goals, to actively shape our lives in ways that reflect our values. This is what Bühler helps us see. But we also need to listen to something deeper than conscious intention, to attend to the symbolic life, to allow ourselves to be guided by purposes we don't fully understand. This is what Jung teaches. The richest meaning might come when these two dimensions align, when our conscious goals and our deeper calling coincide, when the life story we consciously construct expresses the archetypal pattern we're unconsciously living out. Consider Viktor Frankl, a figure who emerged slightly later than both Jung and Bühler, but who synthesized elements of both their visions. Frankl, like Bühler, emphasized that meaning comes through conscious choice, through deciding how we'll respond to circumstances, through commitment to values and purposes beyond ourselves. His logotherapy is explicitly focused on helping people find and pursue meaning. Yet Frankl also spoke of meaning as something we discover rather than invent, as a call that comes to us, as something we must listen for and respond to. There's a dimension of transcendence in his thinking that resonates more with Jung than with Bühler's purely humanistic framework. Perhaps Frankl's synthesis points toward a way of holding both perspectives. We create meaning through our choices, but we discover what's meaningful by attending to something beyond ego. We're agents who shape our lives, but we're also participants in patterns larger than ourselves. Meaning is both conscious life planning and symbolic unfolding, both human project and sacred destiny. Let us consider now how Jung and Bühler understood creativity, another domain where their approaches reveal deep differences. Both saw creativity as central to human flourishing, but they understood it in entirely different terms. For Bühler, creativity was primarily a form of human expression and accomplishment. It was one of the major sources of meaning in life, one of the ways people could experience their lives as worthwhile. She studied creative individuals as part of her biographical research, looking at how they set goals, pursued their vocations, found satisfaction in their work. She saw creativity as available to everyone in some form, not just in the arts, but in how we approach any activity, how we solve problems, how we bring something new into being. Creativity, from this perspective, was a conscious process of imagination and skill. Creative people were those who could envision possibilities and then work to realize them, who could see connections others missed, who could bring their vision into concrete form through disciplined effort. Bühler emphasized the importance of training, of mastering a domain, of sustained work over time. Great creativity required not just talent, but persistence, the ability to keep working toward goals even through frustration and failure. She also emphasized that creativity needed to be balanced with other life goals. Creative people sometimes sacrifice too much in pursuit of their art, neglecting relationships or health. A fully meaningful life required integration, finding space for creative work but also for love, for connection, for other sources of fulfillment. The goal was a balanced life story, not one-sided devotion to any single domain. Jung's understanding of creativity was radically different. For him, creativity was not primarily expression but revelation. The true creative act didn't come from conscious intention but from the unconscious, from the archetypes that spoke through the creator. The artist or writer or visionary was more medium than maker, more midwife than mother to the work that came through them. Jung distinguished between psychological creativity and visionary creativity. Psychological creativity drew from the personal unconscious, from the creator's own experiences and psychology. This kind of creativity, while valuable, was relatively comprehensible, stayed within the bounds of human experience. But visionary creativity drew from the collective unconscious, from the great primordial images that transcend any individual. This creativity had a numinous quality, seemed to come from beyond the personal, spoke to something deep and universal in human nature. The creative person, from Jung's perspective, was often compelled by forces they didn't fully understand or control. The work wanted to be born, used the creator as its instrument. Jung cited many examples. Writers who felt their characters had autonomous life, who simply had to record what the characters did rather than consciously inventing them. Artists who felt possessed by their vision, who had no choice but to give it form. Mystics and prophets who felt addressed by forces beyond themselves. This kind of creativity was often destructive to ordinary life. The creative drive, rooted in the collective unconscious, didn't care about the creator's personal happiness or social adjustment. It demanded everything, sacrificed relationships and health and stability if necessary. Jung saw this not as pathology but as vocation, as the price of being a channel for archetypal energy. Some people were chosen, in a sense, to serve the creative impulse, to give voice to what wanted to be expressed through them. Moreover, Jung saw creativity as essential to individuation. The individuation process itself was a creative act, a bringing into being of something new, the self that emerges when conscious and unconscious are brought into relationship. Active imagination, one of Jung's central techniques, was essentially a creative practice, allowing images to arise from the unconscious and giving them form through painting or writing or movement. The symbols that emerged weren't consciously invented but discovered, allowed to manifest. Jung also believed that creativity served a collective function. The true artist expressed what was stirring in the collective unconscious at a particular time, gave form to energies and patterns that many people were feeling but couldn't articulate. Great art changed consciousness, brought new archetypal possibilities into awareness, helped culture evolve by revealing what had been hidden. The artist was a kind of shaman, a bridge between the collective unconscious and collective consciousness. The differences here are profound. Bühler treats creativity as human expression, something we do through conscious effort and skill. Jung treats it as symbolic revelation, something that happens through us when we're open to the unconscious. Bühler emphasizes the importance of balance, of integrating creative work with other life goals. Jung accepts that creativity may demand sacrifice of ordinary life, that those called to be channels for archetypal energy may have to accept a difficult path. Bühler focuses on the creative process as it unfolds in biographical time across a lifespan. Jung focuses on the creative moment as breakthrough from the timeless depths. Is either view complete without the other? The practicing artist might recognize truth in both. Yes, creativity requires skill and discipline and sustained conscious effort. Bühler is right about this. The romantic myth of inspiration without work, of genius that needs no training, is largely false. Even those touched by visionary creativity must develop the craft to give it form. But yes, there's also something that comes from beyond conscious intention. Moments when you're surprised by what emerges, when the work seems to create itself and you're just the instrument. Jung is right about this too. The most profound creativity perhaps requires both conscious skill and unconscious inspiration, disciplined work and openness to what wants to come through. But there's a deeper question here about agency and determination versus surrender and receptivity, about whether we're primarily creators of our lives or vessels for something that creates through us. This question runs through all the differences between Bühler's and Jung's visions. Bühler's psychology is built on belief in human agency. We can choose our goals, shape our lives, create meaning through our commitments. We're not just passive responders to circumstances or unconscious forces. Self-determination is not an illusion, but a real capacity, one that's central to psychological health. People who experience themselves as agents, who feel they're authoring their own life stories, are more satisfied and more resilient than those who see themselves as victims of circumstance or fate. This emphasis on agency was radical in its time and remains important. How much psychological suffering comes from learned helplessness, from the belief that we're powerless to change our circumstances? How many people live according to scripts written by others, parents, culture, trauma, without ever realizing they can write their own? Bühler's insistence that we can set our own goals, make our own choices, actively shape our lives, was and is a liberating message. Jung's psychology, while not denying ego consciousness and choice, emphasizes the limits of agency. The ego is not master in its own house, beneath or beyond. Consciousness are autonomous forces, complexes, archetypes, the self that pursue their own purposes, whether the ego likes it or not. To believe we're entirely self-determining is inflation, ego, hubris. We're part of something larger, connected to patterns and forces we don't control. True wisdom comes from recognizing our limits, from learning to serve purposes greater than ego wishes. This emphasis on limitation and surrender was also radical and remains important. How much suffering comes from the ego's desperate attempt to control everything, from its refusal to accept what can't be changed? How many people exhaust themselves fighting against their own nature, trying to be someone they're not, pursuing goals that don't reflect their deeper calling? Jung's insistence that we must sometimes surrender, must allow ourselves to be led by the self, must accept that we're not entirely in charge, can be equally liberating. Both truths are needed. We need to claim our agency where we have it, to take responsibility for our choices, to actively shape our lives. But we also need to recognize our limits, to accept what we can't control, to surrender to purposes larger than ego. The challenge is knowing when each is appropriate, when to strive and when to yield, when to assert our will and when to listen for guidance from beyond consciousness. This challenge is particularly acute in the question of life planning versus life unfolding. Bühler's research emphasized the importance of goals, of having a sense of direction, of planning ahead. People who reported life satisfaction were those who had clear purposes, who worked toward ends they valued, who could see their lives as having trajectory and coherence. Aimlessness, by contrast, was associated with dissatisfaction and despair. We need goals to give life structure and meaning, but Jung was deeply suspicious of too much planning. The ego's plans were necessarily limited by what consciousness could envision. The self's purposes were often paradoxical, would take us places we never imagined going, would require us to sacrifice our conscious goals in service to deeper development. If we were too attached to our plans, we'd resist the individuation process, would try to control what needed to unfold organically. We needed to plan lightly, to hold our goals loosely, to be willing to change course when the unconscious showed us a different way. Both perspectives contain wisdom. Goals do give life meaning and direction. Bühler's research confirms this. But rigid attachment to goals can become a prison. Jung's clinical experience confirms this. Perhaps the wisdom is to have clear intentions while remaining open to mystery, to work toward purposes we value while listening for deeper callings, to be both planners and wanderers, both architects and explorers. Let us turn now to the question of the relationship between individual and collective, another domain where Jung and Bühler diverged significantly. Both recognize that human beings exist simultaneously as individuals and as members of collectives, families, communities, cultures, the human species itself. But they understood this double belonging very differently. For Bühler, the relationship between individual and collective was primarily social. We're born into families and cultures that shape us, give us language and values and expectations. Part of development is learning to navigate these social contexts, to adapt to them enough to function while also maintaining our individuality. The key is finding a balance between conformity and autonomy, between meeting social expectations and expressing our unique nature. Healthy development, from this perspective, required developing a strong sense of self that wasn't merely a mirror of social conditioning. The goal was self-determination, the capacity to make choices based on our own values rather than simply internalizing what others expect. Bühler's research showed that people who experienced their lives as meaningful were those who felt they had lived according to their own goals rather than just fulfilling social roles. At the same time, complete isolation from the collective wasn't healthy either. We need relationships, need to contribute to something beyond ourselves, need to feel connected to larger purposes. The most satisfied individuals were those who had found ways to be both authentic individuals and contributing members of their communities. They had integrated personal goals with social contributions, had found ways to express their uniqueness while also serving collective needs. Jung's understanding of the individual-collective relationship operated at a deeper level. Yes, there was the social dimension Bühler described, the tension between persona and personality, between social role and authentic self, but beneath the social level was something more fundamental, the relationship between individual consciousness and the collective unconscious. For Jung, we're not separate individuals who then enter into relationship with a collective. We're born out of the collective, emerge from it through the development of ego consciousness, but remain forever connected to it through the unconscious. The deepest layers of the psyche aren't personal but collective, contain the primordial images and patterns that belong to the species rather than to any individual. Our connection to the collective isn't primarily social but psychic, a shared participation in archetypal structures. This means that individuation becoming a unique individual paradoxically involves connecting more deeply with the collective unconscious. The more we go into ourselves, the more we find what's universal. The personal unconscious, the layer closest to consciousness, contains our particular complexes and forgotten memories. But if we go deeper, we come to the collective layer, where we encounter images and patterns that all humans share. The individuated person isn't someone separate from humanity, but someone who has realized their connection to humanity at the deepest level. Jung also believed that individuals served a function for the collective. Consciousness itself was a relatively recent and precarious evolutionary achievement. The collective unconscious contained vast amounts of psychic energy and content that hadn't yet been integrated into consciousness. The work of individuation served not just the individual, but the collective, helping to bring unconscious contents into awareness, contributing to the evolution of consciousness itself. This is why Jung took seriously phenomena like synchronicity, paranormal experiences, the sense that psyche and world were connected in ways that went beyond cause and effect. If the unconscious was collective, not just individual, then psychic events might have effects beyond the boundaries of a single person. The symbols that arose in one person's dreams might express something stirring in the collective psyche. The transformations one person underwent through individuation might somehow affect the collective field of consciousness. These ideas might sound mystical or even fantastic from a Bühlerian perspective. Where is the evidence that there's a collective unconscious containing universal archetypes? How could we test such a hypothesis? What would it even mean for individual development to serve the evolution of collective consciousness? These aren't questions that can be answered through biographical research or empirical study of life satisfaction. Yet Jung would argue that these ideas are grounded in experience, just not the kind of experience that can be easily measured or quantified. The appearance of identical symbols in the dreams of people from different cultures who have had no contact with each other. The sense of numinosity that comes when we encounter certain images, a feeling of touching something ancient and universal, the fact that myths from all over the world tell similar stories, suggest similar patterns of transformation. the occurrence of synchronistic events that suggest meaningful connection between psyche and world. These phenomena point toward a collective dimension of the psyche that individual consciousness participates in but doesn't create. From a modern perspective, we might try to bridge these views. Recent research in evolutionary psychology suggests that humans do have innate predispositions, what we might call psychological universals. All humans develop language, form attachments, recognize emotions, categorize experience in similar ways. Perhaps Jung's archetypes are attempts to describe these universal structures, though Jung's language is symbolic and mythological rather than scientific. Similarly, research on meaning and life satisfaction has largely confirmed Bühler's findings. People who have clear goals, who feel they're living according to their values, who experience themselves as agents rather than victims, do report higher well-being. Her empirical approach yielded real and replicable findings. Yet this doesn't mean Jung was wrong about the symbolic dimension. Perhaps both are true. We need conscious goal pursuit for life satisfaction, and we need connection to the symbolic life for depth and wholeness. These might be different but complementary aspects of human flourishing. Consider how Jung and Bühler might approach the question of death and aging, those final chapters of the human story. Both recognize that how we face death is crucial to the meaning of life, but their perspectives were characteristically different. For Bühler, successful aging involved maintaining purpose and engagement for as long as possible. Her research showed that elderly people who remained active, who continued to set goals even if these were more modest than in earlier years, who felt they still had contributions to make, reported higher life satisfaction than those who became passive or withdrawn. At the same time, successful aging required accepting limitations, adjusting goals to changing capacities, finding new sources of meaning when old ones were no longer available. The final task of late adulthood, in Bühler's framework, was life review and integration. People needed to look back on their lives and come to terms with what they'd done, to accept both accomplishments and failures, to make peace with the life they'd lived. This was a conscious process of meaning-making, of constructing a narrative that gave coherence to the whole. Those who could do this, who could say this was my life and it was worth living, approached death with equanimity. Those who were filled with regret or bitterness, who felt their lives had been wasted or meaningless, faced death with despair. This vision is deeply humanistic. It locates meaning entirely within human life itself, within what we've experienced and accomplished and contributed. Death is the end. But if we've lived well, if we can look back with satisfaction, then we can accept that end without needing belief in anything beyond. This is a mature, stoic vision. Life is what we make of it. Death comes to us all, and wisdom lies in living fully and accepting courageously. Jung's approach to death was more mysterious and more speculative. He believed that the psyche continues to develop right up to death and perhaps beyond. The approach of death activates particular archetypal patterns, what Jung called the transition to the next life. Dreams of the dying often contain symbols of transformation journeys, crossings, vehicles of transport, images that suggest continuation rather than simply ending. Jung took these symbols seriously. While he made no dogmatic claims about life after death, he believed that the psyche behaves as if it continues. The unconscious seems not to accept death as simply termination. The symbols it produces suggest transformation, transition, continuation in some form. Jung felt that the psyche's own behavior should be respected, that if the unconscious consistently produces images of afterlife and continuation, this says something important, even if we can't verify it objectively. Moreover, Jung believed that how we face death is connected to how we've lived the second half of life. Those who have individuated, who have come to terms with their own nature, who have integrated conscious and unconscious, approach death differently than those who have lived only in ego consciousness. The individuated person has already undergone many deaths of old identities, of ego inflation, of one-sided attitudes. They've learned that death and rebirth are the pattern of transformation, so physical death is in some sense familiar, another threshold, another transformation rather than absolute annihilation. Jung also emphasized that we should orient toward death rather than simply denying it. Western culture, he observed, tries to hide death away, to avoid thinking about it, to maintain the fiction that we'll live forever. This is psychologically unhealthy. Death gives life meaning, provides the frame that makes our choices matter. If we never die, nothing we do has particular significance. It's precisely because life is finite that it's precious, that our time matters, that we must choose carefully how to spend it. The individuated person, Jung suggested, faces death consciously, prepares for it, not with fear, but with curiosity and even anticipation. What is this great mystery we all must meet? What lies beyond the threshold? The psyche's symbols suggest transformation rather than mere ending, and while we can't know for certain, we can trust the psyche's own wisdom, its own sense of what comes next. The contrast here reflects their fundamental difference. Bühler's vision is secular, confined to life as we know it, finding meaning entirely within the span of birth to death. Jung's vision is spiritual, or at least open to the spiritual, finding meaning and connection to something that transcends individual existence, that perhaps continues beyond death, which brings more comfort as we face our mortality. For some, Bühler's vision is adequate and beautiful, to have lived fully, to have pursued meaningful goals, to have made contributions that continue after us, to accept death as the natural end of a life well lived. This is enough. Others need what Jung offers, the sense of connection to something eternal, the symbols that suggest continuation, the hope or faith that death is not the end, but a transformation. Perhaps both are needed, or different people need different visions at different times. The wisdom might be to live as Bühler advises, setting goals, making choices, creating meaning through how we spend our days, while also remaining open to what Jung describes, the symbolic life, the sense of participating in patterns larger than our individual existence, the possibility that consciousness continues in forms we can't yet imagine. Let us reflect now on the question of therapy and psychological help, for this too reveals profound differences. Both Jung and Bühler wanted to help people live better, more meaningful lives, but their approaches were worlds apart. Bühler's therapeutic work, especially in her later years when she contributed to humanistic psychology, emphasized helping people clarify their goals and values, make conscious choices, take responsibility for their lives. The therapist's role was to facilitate self-determination, to help clients understand what they truly want rather than what they've been taught to want, to support them in making changes that align their lives with their values. This might involve biographical review, looking at the life story and identifying where the person had been living according to others' expectations rather than their own goals. It might involve exploring values, helping the client articulate what matters most to them. It might involve concrete goal setting and problem solving, figuring out practical steps toward a more meaningful life. The emphasis was on consciousness, on choice, on agency. The therapeutic relationship was collaborative, with therapist and client working together toward goals the client defined. Jungian therapy is different in almost every respect. While Jung certainly talked with his patients, asked about their lives, offered interpretations and advice, the real work happened at a deeper level. The focus was on the unconscious, on dreams and active imagination, on the symbols through which the psyche communicated. Jung's role was less to help patients set goals than to help them hear what the unconscious was trying to say, to midwife the emergence of contents that consciousness had been ignoring or repressing. This meant that Jungian therapy often moved into territory that would seem strange from a Bühlerian perspective. Patients would report dreams, and Jung would explore them in elaborate detail, teasing out symbolic meanings, connecting dream images to myths and fairy tales and alchemical texts, helping the patient understand what the unconscious was trying to communicate. Or patients would engage in active imagination, entering into dialogue with inner figures, painting or writing or sculpting the images that arose. The goal was not to set conscious goals, but to establish a relationship with the unconscious, to create an ongoing dialogue between ego and self. Moreover, Jungian therapy accepted that the process couldn't be rushed or controlled. Individuation unfolds according to its own timetable. There might be long periods of confusion or regression. Patients might need to go through what looked like breakdown to reach breakthrough. The therapist's role was to contain the process, to provide a safe space for transformation, to trust the psyche's own wisdom even when the conscious mind didn't understand what was happening. The therapeutic relationship itself was different. Jung emphasized the mutuality of the process. The therapist was not a neutral blank screen, but a real person who was also affected by the work, who might learn from the patient as much as the patient learned from the therapist. Analysis was an alchemical vessel in which both participants were transformed. The therapist needed to have done their own inner work, needed to have faced their own shadow and their own unconscious, not to be perfect, but to be conscious of their own complexes so these didn't contaminate the work. These different therapeutic approaches reflect different visions of what psychological help means. Is it helping people become more conscious, more self-determining, better able to set and pursue meaningful goals? Or is it helping people connect with the unconscious, hear the symbolic life, allow transformation to happen according to the self's purposes? Is the therapist, a coach, helping the client achieve their goals, or a guide helping the client navigate unknown territory, or a companion sharing in a journey of mutual transformation? Again, we might say that different people need different things at different times. Someone stuck in passivity, living according to others' scripts, unable to claim their own agency, might benefit greatly from Bühler's approach. They need to be reminded that they can choose, that they have power to shape their lives, that meaning comes from conscious commitment to personally relevant goals. Someone stuck in ego inflation, trying to control everything, cut off from the unconscious, living a one-sided life, might need Jung's approach. They need to learn to listen to what's beneath consciousness, to surrender some ego control, to allow the self to guide their development. The skilled therapist might integrate both, helping clients claim agency while also honoring the autonomous movements of the psyche, supporting conscious goal setting while also attending to dreams and symbols, working in the practical realm of behavioral change while remaining open to the symbolic dimension of transformation. This integration might honor what's true in both visions, without demanding that one must be right and the other wrong. Now we arrive at questions that take us beyond either Jung or Bühler individually, into reflections on what their dialogue reveals about the nature of human consciousness and being. Let your breath slow now. Let your body sink deeper into rest as we move into more spacious contemplation. What does it mean to be human? How do we understand the strange fact of self-consciousness, of being creatures who can observe ourselves, who wonder about our own nature, who seek meaning in our existence? Jung and Bühler give us two lenses for looking at this mystery, and when we hold both lenses together, the image that emerges is richer and stranger than either alone could provide. From Bühler's perspective, to be human is to be a goal-directed organism moving through time, capable of conscious choice and self-determination, creating meaning through engagement with life's tasks and challenges. We are our life stories, the narratives we construct from the raw material of experience. We are what we choose, what we commit to, what we make of the years we're given. This is a vision of humans as active agents, as creators of meaning, as beings who face forward into the future, who plan and strive and shape their own becoming. There's something profoundly democratic and empowering about this vision. It says that meaning isn't reserved for mystics or saints, isn't dependent on special insight or spiritual gifts. Every human life can be meaningful if lived with consciousness and intention. The grandmother who raised her children well, the teacher who inspired students, the craftsman who took pride in work well done. All these ordinary lives contain meaning if lived according to values the person held, if experienced as self-determined rather than imposed. Meaning is available to all, requires no special access to transcendent realms, emerges from the dignified human project of making something worthwhile from the material of our days. From Jung's perspective, to be human is to be a conscious node in a vast network of psychic energy that transcends the individual, a place where the unconscious becomes conscious, where archetypal patterns that are millions of years old achieve temporary visibility and expression. We are not primarily creators but vessels, not primarily agents but participants in processes larger than ourselves. This is a vision of humans as mystery, even to ourselves, as connected to depths we can only glimpse in dreams and symbols, as called to transformation according to purposes beyond ego comprehension. There's something humbling and awe-inspiring about this vision. It says that we're more than we think we are, that beneath the surface of conscious experience are depths, connecting us to all humanity, to patterns that stretch back to the beginning of consciousness itself, the symbols that move us, the myths that speak to our condition, the dreams that guide us. These aren't just personal but transpersonal, reveal aspects of soul that belong not to us alone, but to the human collective. We're individuals, yes, but individuals who carry within ourselves the entire human story, who participate in a drama vastly larger than our personal lives. Can these visions be reconciled? Or must we choose between them, between a humanistic psychology of conscious choice and an archetypal psychology of unconscious depths, between seeing ourselves primarily as agents or primarily as vessels? Perhaps the reconciliation lies in recognizing that both are true but at different levels. We are conscious egos moving through biographical time, setting goals and making choices. Bühler is right about this. And we are also nodes in a collective psychic field, participating in patterns we don't create and can't fully control. Jung is right about this. Both dimensions are real. To be fully human might mean honoring both, living consciously while remaining open to mystery, taking responsibility while accepting limitation, creating meaning while also discovering it. Or perhaps the reconciliation lies in seeing them as complementary rather than contradictory, as addressing different questions. If you ask, "How do I live a satisfying life?" Bühler offers a good answer. Set meaningful goals, make self-determined choices, actively shape your story. If you ask, "Who am I, really?" Jung offers a profound answer. More than you think, connected to depths you're only beginning to explore, called to wholeness through a process that transcends ego understanding. These are both good questions, both deserving of answers. Or perhaps there is no full reconciliation, and we must accept living with the tension between these perspectives, must inhabit the paradox of being. Simultaneously conscious choosers and unconscious participants, agents of our own becoming, and objects of transformation by forces beyond us. Perhaps human being is inherently paradoxical, can't be captured by any single perspective, requires multiple lenses to even glimpse its complexity. Let us consider the question of time, for this too is at the heart of their difference. Bühler's psychology is fundamentally temporal. She maps lives across biographical time, from birth through childhood, adolescence, adulthood, old age, to death. Development is movement through time, is the accumulation of experience, the pursuit of goals across decades, the story with beginning, middle, and end. Meaning emerges in time from the coherence we create in the temporal structure of our lives. Jung's psychology includes temporal development, but also points to something beyond time. The archetypes are eternal patterns, exist outside of biographical time even as they manifest within it. The symbols that arise from the collective unconscious speak a timeless language, connect us to the same patterns that moved our ancestors thousands of years ago. Individuation is a temporal process, unfolds across the years of a life, but what it seeks wholeness, the realization of the self, has an eternal quality, is something that always already exists and is being gradually revealed rather than constructed. This difference in relationship to time affects everything else. If development is fundamentally temporal, then what matters is what we do with our time, how we spend our days, what we accomplish in the years we have. Loss of time is tragedy. Wasted years are genuinely wasted. We must use our time well, must make our time count, because once it's gone forever. If development is also connected to something eternal, then time is relativized. What matters is not just what we accomplish in time, but how we connect to the timeless. A single moment of genuine self-knowledge, a single dream that reveals an archetypal truth, might be more significant than decades of busy accomplishment. Time in service to individuation isn't time passing but time deepening, isn't moving forward but spiraling inward, isn't linear progress but cyclical return to the same themes at greater depth. Both perspectives on time are needed. We do live in biographical time, age and change, have limited years that we must use consciously. Bühler helps us honor this dimension, helps us see that we can't wait forever, that we must choose and act and make something of the time we have. But we also have access to dimensions of experience that transcend clock time, that connect us to something eternal. Jung helps us honor this dimension, helps us see that there's more than the temporal story, that consciousness can know itself beyond time. The practical implication might be to live in time while also touching timelessness, to plan and strive and accomplish while also remaining open to moments when time stops, when we touch something eternal, when the symbolic life speaks to us in a language beyond past, present, future. To spend our days consciously while also making space for depth, for contemplation, for the encounter with what doesn't change beneath all change. Consider the question of suffering, for both Jung and Bühler had to account for the pain that is woven into human existence. How do their different perspectives help us understand and bear suffering? For Bühler, suffering comes primarily from thwarted goals, from feeling unable to shape one's life, from experiences of meaninglessness or lack of purpose. The research showed that people who felt helpless, who saw themselves as victims of circumstances they couldn't control, who felt their lives were without direction or significance, these people suffered more than those who maintained a sense of agency and meaning, even in difficult circumstances. The way through suffering, from this perspective, is to find meaning in it, to see how we can still exercise choice even in constrained circumstances, to discover purposes that transcend the suffering. Viktor Frankl's experience in concentration camps exemplified this. Even in the most dehumanizing conditions imaginable, people could still choose how they responded, could still find meaning through how they bore their suffering, could still maintain dignity and human connection. Suffering that has meaning is more bearable than suffering that seems pointless. Jung saw suffering differently. For him, suffering was often necessary for psychological development, particularly for individuation. The comfortable life, the life without challenges or conflicts, was not the path to wholeness. We grow through suffering, through being forced to confront what we've been avoiding, through the dissolution of rigid ego structures that must break down before something new can emerge. Jung spoke of the Via Crucis, the way of the cross, as a pattern of transformation, death and rebirth, suffering and redemption, the descent into darkness before the emergence into light. These are archetypal patterns that appear in myths and religions around the world, because they describe something real about psychic development. The ego must suffer, must be crucified in a sense, must surrender its inflation and recognize its limitations for the self to be born. Moreover, some suffering comes not from thwarted personal goals, but from the burden of consciousness itself, from being aware of the tragedy and mystery of existence. Jung quoted the Gnostics saying that the human being is a god suspended in a cage of ribs. We carry within us an element of the divine, the self, but we're trapped in the limitations of physical existence, of time and death and suffering. This fundamental existential suffering can't be cured by better goal setting or increased agency. It can only be endured and perhaps transformed through connection to the symbolic life, through finding meaning in the archetypal patterns of death and rebirth. Both perspectives offer something true. Bühler is right that much suffering is decreased when we maintain a sense of meaning and agency, when we feel we're still choosing how to respond even if we can't control circumstances. Jung is right that some suffering is necessary and even valuable, that it serves the individuation process, that trying to eliminate all suffering would impoverish us. Perhaps wisdom lies in distinguishing between suffering that diminishes us and suffering that transforms us, between pain that comes from meaninglessness and pain that comes from growth. The practical implication might be to ask, when we suffer, can I find meaning in this? Can I still exercise choice in how I respond? These are Bühler's questions, and they're valuable, but also to ask, What is this suffering trying to teach me? What in me needs to die so that something new can be born? What is the symbolic meaning of this pain? These are Jung's questions, and they too are valuable. Together, they give us multiple ways of working with the inevitable suffering that comes with being human and alive. As we drift closer to sleep, let us consider one more question: the relationship between individual development and collective evolution, between personal growth and the larger story of humanity's becoming. Both Jung and Bühler lived through catastrophic times: 2 world wars, the rise of totalitarianism, the threat of nuclear annihilation. Both tried to understand how psychology could contribute to a better world, but their visions of how this might happen were characteristically different. For Bühler, the hope lay in helping more people live conscious, self-determined lives, in fostering the development of mature adults who could make wise choices, pursue meaningful goals, contribute to their communities. If psychology could help people become more psychologically healthy, more capable of genuine relationships, more committed to values beyond mere self-interest, then perhaps humanity could build a better society. It was a bottom-up vision. Change individuals, and eventually you change the collective. She emphasized the importance of studying optimal development, not just pathology. Psychology shouldn't just help sick people get well, but should help all people flourish, should identify the conditions under which humans thrive and work to create those conditions more widely. Her contribution to humanistic psychology was part of this vision, a psychology that emphasized human potential, that believed in the possibility of growth and positive change, that refused to reduce humans to mechanisms or see them as inevitably determined by biology or conditioning. Jung's vision for collective change was more paradoxical and perhaps more pessimistic. He believed that the most important thing any individual could do for the collective was to individuate, to become conscious of their own shadow and archetypes, to withdraw projections and take back energy from collective identifications. But this was precisely because he saw the collective as the source of so much unconsciousness and destructiveness. Jung believed that collective movements, nationalism, ideological fanaticism, mass movements of all kinds were manifestations of the collective unconscious flooding consciousness. When individuals weren't conscious of their own depths, when they hadn't integrated their shadows, they were vulnerable to possession by archetypal forces. This is what happened in Nazi Germany, what Jung saw as a possession of the German people by Wotan, an archaic god of storm and frenzy. Millions of individuals lost their individual consciousness, merged with the collective, became capable of atrocities they never would have committed as conscious individuals. The only protection against such collective possession, Jung believed, was individual consciousness. Each person who became conscious of their own shadow meant one less person projecting that shadow onto others. Each person who individuated meant one more center of conscious awareness that couldn't be simply absorbed into collective movements. The individuated person could stand against the collective when necessary, could maintain their own center even in the face of group pressure, could serve as a point of light in collective darkness. This vision might seem more elitist than Bühler's. Jung wasn't offering a path that everyone would or could follow. Individuation is difficult, requires resources of time and money and psychological resilience that not everyone has. It's perhaps inevitably a path for the few rather than the many. Yet Jung believed that even a few individuated people made a difference, served as anchors of consciousness that somehow affected the collective field. Can we reconcile these visions? Perhaps by saying that both are needed, that we need Bühler's work to help make psychological health and meaning-making available to as many people as possible, to democratize the insights of psychology, to foster the development of conscious, self-determining individuals. And we need Jung's work to take those who can go deeper, who are called to the more difficult work of individuation, who serve the collective precisely by becoming more fully individual. Or perhaps we can't reconcile them, must accept that they represent different values, different visions of what psychology is for. Bühler's is more egalitarian, more optimistic about human nature and human potential, more focused on helping people live better lives by ordinary standards. Jung's is more aristocratic in a sense, more aware of the dark side of human nature and collective life, more focused on transformation that might not make life better by conventional standards, but makes it more conscious and more whole. As you sink towards sleep now, feeling the weight of your body in the bed, the softness of the pillow beneath your head, let these different perspectives wash over you like waves, each bringing something valuable, neither complete without the other. Charlotte Bühler, walking through Vienna in the 1930s, interviewing subjects about their life stories, building careful theories from empirical observation. Carl Jung in his tower at Bollingen, painting images from his dreams on the stone walls, descending again and again into the depths to see what the unconscious might reveal. Two approaches to the mystery of human becoming, two ways of honoring the strange gift of consciousness. What would Jung and Bühler say to each other if they could meet now, freed from the contexts that constrained them, able to see their work from the perspective of decades? Perhaps Jung would acknowledge that Bühler was right about the importance of conscious choice and agency, that his emphasis on the unconscious sometimes risked making people too passive, too willing to wait for the self to show them the way rather than actively shaping their lives. Perhaps he would grant that empirical research has its place, that we do need to measure and count and verify, that not everything can be left to symbolic interpretation, and perhaps Bühler would acknowledge that Jung was right about dimensions of experience that her methods couldn't easily capture, that there is something beyond conscious goal setting, that the symbolic life is real and important, that humans are more mysterious and more connected to transpersonal patterns than her humanistic framework allowed. Perhaps she would grant that depth has its own validity, that not everything that matters can be measured, that the unconscious is more than just personal history waiting to be made conscious. In their imagined conversation, they might find more common ground than their different approaches suggest. Both believe that development continues throughout life, that midlife is a crucial turning point, that meaning is central to human flourishing. Both insisted that humans are more than mechanisms, that consciousness matters, that we're capable of growth and transformation. Both devoted their lives to understanding human becoming, to helping people live better and more fully. Their differences weren't obstacles to be overcome, but perspectives to be held together, lenses that show us different aspects of the same complex reality. The human psyche is both conscious and unconscious, both agent and participant, both creator and vessel. We move through biographical time while also touching timelessness. We make choices while also being shaped by forces beyond choice. We create meaning while also discovering it. We are both the individual pursuing our goals across the span of a life, and the node in a collective network of consciousness stretching back to the beginning of human awareness. To honor both Bühler and Jung is to honor the full complexity of what it means to be human, to refuse simple answers, to accept living with paradox and mystery. It's to plan our lives consciously while also listening for the unexpected, to work toward goals we value while also remaining open to transformation, to take responsibility for our choices while also accepting that we're not entirely in control. It's to create meaningful life stories while also attending to the symbols that suggest we're part of a story much larger than our own. As sleep approaches now, as consciousness begins to dissolve into that mysterious realm where dreams await, consider your own life in light of these two perspectives. What are the goals you've set, the values you've chosen, the story you're consciously creating? This is your Bühlerian life, the visible trajectory of your becoming, the meaning you're making through your choices and commitments. Honor this. Your agency is real. Your choices matter. The meaning you create through how you live your days is genuine and valuable. But also, what dreams have come to you lately? What images from the unconscious have tried to catch your attention? What have you been avoiding in yourself, refusing to integrate? Where has life surprised you, taking you places you never planned to go? This is your Jungian life, the invisible story of your soul, the meaning that's being discovered through encounters with the unconscious. Honor this too. Your depths are real. The symbolic life has its own wisdom. The transformation that happens through you, not by you, is genuine and necessary. Perhaps the complete life, the whole life, is lived when we honor both dimensions, when we're both architects planning and building, and explorers wandering into unknown territory, when we're both authors consciously crafting our story, and characters discovering that we're in a story we didn't write, when we're both firmly rooted in the world of time and goals and accomplishment, and also open to the eternal dimension that lives in depths beneath the surface of days. Charlotte Bühler mapped the outer landscape of human development, the visible patterns of life stories unfolding across time. Carl Jung mapped the inner landscape, the invisible patterns of psychic transformation. Together, their maps give us a more complete picture, show us the full terrain of human becoming. We need both maps for the journey. We need the clarity of conscious goals and the mystery of unconscious depths. We need the discipline of empirical research and the openness to symbolic wisdom. We need the dignity of self-determination and the humility of surrender to forces larger than ego. Their dialogue continues in us, in each person who tries to live consciously while remaining open to mystery, who sets goals while also listening for deeper callings, who takes responsibility while also accepting limitation. We are the living conversation between these perspectives, the place where conscious and unconscious meet, where biographical time and eternal depths intersect, where human agency and archetypal pattern dance together in the creation of a life. Sleep now, wanderer. Let these thoughts drift away like clouds dissolving into sky. Your life is both story and symbol, both conscious project and unconscious unfolding, both human creation and sacred revelation. You are both the person you're becoming through your choices and the person you're discovering through your depths. Both perspectives honor something true about you, about all of us, about this strange and beautiful mystery of human consciousness. As you descend into sleep, into that realm where the ego loosens its grip and the unconscious rises to speak in the language of dreams, carry with you the wisdom of both these seekers. Let Bühler remind you that you have power, that your choices matter, that you can shape your life according to your values. Let Jung remind you that you're more than you think, that you carry within you depths connecting to all humanity, that transformation comes through surrender as much as through striving. The conversation between them continues in the quiet of night, in the space between waking and dreaming, in the mystery of a consciousness that can observe itself and wonder at its own nature. Rest now in that mystery. Let sleep take you into the depths where the symbols dwell, where the self waits patiently for consciousness to discover what it's always already been. Tomorrow you'll wake and return to the world of time and goals and choices, the Bühlerian world of biographical unfolding. But tonight, in dreams, you visit the Jungian world of symbol and archetype, of timeless patterns and collective depths. Both worlds are yours. Both journeys are real. Both stories, the one you're consciously creating and the one you're unconsciously living, are threads in the larger tapestry of your becoming. Sleep well, traveler. The path of human development winds between visible and invisible, between conscious and unconscious, between time and eternity. Charlotte Bühler and Carl Jung walked different sections of this path, saw different vistas, brought back different maps. But the path is one, and you walk it each day and each night, each choice and each dream, each conscious goal and each unconscious transformation, weaving together the many threads that make a human life. The conversation between great minds echoes through time, helps us understand ourselves, illuminates the vast territories of consciousness we're all exploring. Tonight we've listened to the dialogue between the chronicler of life's purposeful unfolding and the cartographer of the collective unconscious, between the empiricist of development across the lifespan and the mystic of symbolic transformation. Their voices remain distinct, their approaches different, but together they sing a fuller song about what it means to become human, to grow, to find meaning, to live the one life we're given with as much consciousness and grace as we can muster. Rest now. Let the darkness hold you. Let consciousness release its grip. Let sleep bring its own wisdom, its own healing, its own dreams. The journey of becoming continues even in sleep, even in the depths, even in the spaces between thoughts where something larger than ego waits to be discovered. You are both the person you're consciously becoming and the person you're unconsciously already. Both stories are true. Both journeys matter. Good night, wanderer. Until we meet again in these quiet hours to explore another conversation between great minds, another perspective on the infinite complexity of human consciousness. Sleep well in the knowledge that you're held by forces both known and unknown, that you're developing according to patterns both conscious and unconscious, that your life has meaning both in what you create and in what you discover. The path winds on, through day and night, through time and eternity, through the outer biography of visible accomplishment and the inner mythology of invisible transformation. Rest, dream, become. The work of being human continues, guided by the wisdom of those who came before, by the Bühlers who mapped the visible journey and the Jungs who explored the invisible depths. You are heir to both traditions, beneficiary of both perspectives, traveler on a path illuminated by many lights. Sleep now, and let the night reveal what it will. Let dreams speak their symbolic language. Let the unconscious do its quiet work of integration and transformation. The conversation ends, as all conversations must, but the questions remain, the mystery continues, the journey of human becoming goes on. Charlotte Bühler and Carl Jung, different as they were, shared this. They both honored the journey. Both devoted their lives to understanding human growth and meaning. Both left us gifts of insight that help us navigate our own path through the mystery of consciousness. Good night. Sleep well. Dream deeply. Tomorrow you'll wake to the world of choice and goals and conscious living, but tonight belongs to the depths, to the symbols, to the unconscious that never sleeps but works in its own way toward the wholeness that is every person's birthright and deepest calling. Rest now, traveler. The night holds you. The path continues. The conversation between consciousness and unconscious, between visible biography and invisible mythology, between human agency and archetypal pattern, goes on in you, in all of us, in the ongoing mystery of what it means to be alive, aware, and becoming. Sleep brings its own wisdom. Trust it. Surrender to it. Let it take you where you need to go. And so our story ends where all good bedtime stories end, in the peaceful darkness of sleep, in the letting go of thoughts, in the surrender to rest that every living being needs. Jung and Bühler have shown us their different paths, offered their different wisdoms, given us their different maps of the territory of line, human development. We take what serves us from each, hold their insights gently as we drift towards sleep, grateful for the light they've shed on the mystery we're all living. Good night, dear traveler. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may your sleep be deep, your dreams be rich, your rest be complete. The journey of becoming continues, guided by both conscious choice and unconscious wisdom, shaped by both biographical unfolding and symbolic transformation. You are both story and symbol, both creator and vessel, both the person you're making yourself to be and the person you're discovering you've always been. Sleep now. The night awaits. The depths beckon. The unconscious has its own work to do. Let it work. Let yourself rest. Let the conversation between all that you know and all that you're discovering continue in the depths where words dissolve into silence and consciousness gives way to the vast mystery from which all consciousness emerges and to which it all returns. Good night. Sleep well. Dream true. The path winds on, and we'll walk it again tomorrow, a little more conscious, a little more whole, carrying the wisdom of those who walked before us, guided by both the light of understanding and the darkness of mystery, both the certainty of choice and the surrender to transformation. Rest now in the peace of night, in the quiet of ending, in the gentleness of letting go. Tomorrow brings its own journey, but tonight belongs to sleep, to dreams, to the depths where Charlotte Bühler's empirical observations and Carl Jung's archetypal visions both dissolve into the greater mystery that holds us all. Good night, wanderer. Good night.